If you asked me to pick one word that described the past several years of life on this planet, I wouldn't have to think too hard about it. From natural disasters sweeping across the world to a global pandemic and the many wars and political struggles people are facing, one word comes to my mind right away: chaos. Chaos has a way of disrupting our ability to see the path forward in life. In times of chaos, it's harder to believe that whatever path you start moving down will still be there in the future. But chaos doesn't just come to us through global or national events. Sometimes our lives are thrown off track by other things, like divorce, the death of a friend or family member, conflicts at work, or a relapse into addiction. Whatever the reasons might be, there's one tendency that humans often have in those chaotic times. When we're in chaos, we're drawn to structure, and few things offer structure as readily and consistently as religion. But there's a danger in clinging to structure too tightly. When we hold on to rules and traditions so tightly that we can no longer see the purpose of them, we risk losing sight of why Christianity exists in the first place. When Christians begin to prioritize structure more than principles, we can become controlling and intolerant and even risk hurting the people around us. Structure can be a helpful thing, and traditions can be beautiful in their proper context. But if we really want to love people the way Jesus did, we have to be able to take an honest look at what kind of people they're leading us to become. In this episode, we're talking with Jon Holland, who formerly served as a pastor and now lives in the greater Portland area with his family. Jon's journey over the past several years has led him through a long process of questioning, growth, and a deeper sense of faith in a God that really meets us wherever we are. Join us as we revisit that journey together, today on Bridges Over Walls.
I was raised by my mom, so she raised 3 boys and sacrificed a lot to give us Christian education. So our upbringing was in a Christian home for the most part. She was going at it as best she could, navigating things, giving us lessons and teachings and so forth that she had just heard herself maybe that day.
I'm imagining being a parent, and I just learned something that I want to teach my kids that I don't fully understand yet. For the kid, did you have a chance to really dig into some of the things that you believed, explore it, challenge it, doubt it?
It's interesting now, myself being a parent, my wife and I have 2 boys, 11 and 10, and kind of in a way reliving what this was like for my mom when I was this age, right? Herself, she didn't really have questions, right? She just, I don't know if she really knew what she was searching for, but whatever it was, she wanted the love of Jesus. She's like, whatever this is, I want to know him. Because her upbringing had been very dysfunctional and there had been some voids in her life. And so I think, if anything, she gravitated towards that love. But in our home, it was more of the do's and the don'ts that came out. For her, again, doing the best she could, she just didn't know how to navigate this. It was new to her. But the opportunity to question or to ask wasn't really there too much. So my discovery, if you will, or my questioning came later in life, college age, probably high school into college age. There was a time of self-inflicted exile, where I wandered off and just kind of said, if this system, if this religion, if this is all about do's and don'ts, I think I'm good trying something else. And so I wandered off for a bit, looking at other options that were out there that led me down a different direction. And I soon learned that's not really the answer either that I'm looking for. And so there was this time in my life when I'm living in the mountains of Colorado. Beautiful place. I'm a Texas boy who didn't know much about mountains and snow for that matter, living in this beautiful place and I'm just feeling empty and lonely. And so there was this experience I had in nature where I felt God loved me and he missed me and wanted me back in his family, if you will, in part of his, plans for my life. And so here I am in the mountains wondering, what do I do, right? Like, I've just said yes to God. He spoke to me through the book of nature here. I'm out here seeing this beauty and recognizing something's missing in my life. And so when I said yes to want to follow him, I went back in the day when they had phone books, I opened a phone book and went to churches, right, and looked for the denominations that are listed there and tried to find one in my area that was an Adventist church, an Adventist congregation. And so I kind of went back to what I knew, went back to what I was taught, what I was raised with. And so entering into pastoral ministry, I carried some of that baggage, if you will, the do's and the don'ts, and more of the outward focus on outward obedience with me into pastoral ministry.
I want to go back to one of the things, the kind of themes of your growing up experience that we talked about before the show. You guys moved around a lot, right?
Yes, man. 20 plus times, and then I lost count with my mom between the ages of 7, 8, and college. So there's been a lot of moves, a lot of change. Change has been the constant, a lot of superficial relationships when it comes to all those moves with school, colleagues. And then that carried on as I met my now wife, and we've been married 18 years. In those 18 years of marriage, we've moved 13 times.
Tell me about like what it's like to be in this constant state of change, of uncertainty, of instability. You know, where does that leave you?
A product, if you will, a byproduct of all of this change, all of this instability was an attempt to fix or control or to have some sense of stability. And so I felt at times a tendency to overcorrect, if you will, by controlling or trying to control the things around me because I needed that stability in the chaos that was happening in my life.
Honestly, I think a lot of people coming into religion have this experience where life is chaotic, maybe of their own choices, maybe of their family, maybe of the world they're in, and religion offers some kind of foundation for them, some stability, some certainty, a set of rules, a set of guidelines for your life that no matter what's going on in your life, that feeling of certainty, that feeling of structure appeals to you sometimes, you know, because it's offering something that you haven't had.
Yeah. You're spot on when it comes to that kind of human tendency, especially in the context of chaos, to want to have stability. And I feel for my mom, again, coming back to raising us, doing the best that she could, needing some kind of pattern, some kind of list of things to kind of check off and make sure her kids understood this. That kind of black and white thing is what we may gravitate towards because it gives us some stability. It gives us a blueprint, if you will, something to go by that we feel at the time maybe gives us some peace. But then that can also be used to then keep people in check or keep people, control. And part of that carried over into my pastoral ministry. So you have this outline of things you're supposed to do and not do. So then in your own home, you're trying to live those out. Kids are going to eat a certain way, going to dress a certain way. My wife's going to eat a certain way, dress a certain way. And then you have expectations your church members have of you as a pastor, where you want to make sure they see you as whoever that person's supposed to look like in their mind. So you're trying to adhere to a list maybe that they have for you as well. It was overwhelming almost. So I thought I was finding peace or some kind of stability by having all these different lists, but the list became overwhelming.
When I moved to Oregon, one of the first things I did was interview pastors. And this is one of the consistent themes that I found is very often the pastor is the one that's been created by the expectations of the church. And especially in a kind of a traditional kind of church like the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there are a lot of ways where the pastor is meeting an expectation of them that they don't even hold that value necessarily, except that they don't want to offend people, they don't want to lead them away from God, and so they do the things just because the church members expect them to. One pastor that I greatly respect, huge influence on my life, he came to my house and he was so excited and he was acting like he was like smuggling something in. I mean, I was just like, well, what are you doing? And he had this set of all these different kinds of coffee. And he was like, I'm so excited that I can share this with you because I can't tell the church that I drink coffee. And to me, it's such a trivial thing, coffee, right? It's just like, man, that's the thing that you're worried about when this world is so full of prejudice and, violence and all of this stuff. But coffee is the thing that you're afraid to share that you do. It was this really heartwarming moment that I was trusted by the pastor, but it was also this very sad moment where I was like, I wish you could just have your own convictions and we could respect that, and that we could be led by somebody who has a different set of convictions maybe even than we do. But I don't think that's what most pastors are facing. I think that they're facing a lot of expectations, even pastors' spouses.
You ask my wife, Melinda, and she will say, I did not marry a pastor. Right. When we said the I do's, I was not in pastoral ministry. I wasn't in ministry really at all. I was helping out at a local church in Texas and just wanting to help with their youth department, that kind of thing. So her saying yes was to a guy that just, we want to have fun and live together and serve the church, but not in that specific role. And so later in life, 10 years or so after being married, we get into this role and it was different. We have two boys, 16 months apart. They were both probably under 3 years old. And as a single mom on those days that I'm preaching and going between two churches, I mean, she's basically by herself. I'm running around doing this, doing that, talking, preaching, doing all these things. She brought a bunch of toys, sat down in the church sanctuary there before service began. And just, the kid grabs the bag and dumps all the Legos, whatever it was, And there was a guy in there who turned around and just gave her this scowl. You're the pastor's wife. You should know better than to bring your kids in here and dump all these toys out on the floor. And she just looked at him and smiled and just waved like this, one of those things where it was just, hey, I'm here. We're here to worship too. It's those expectations, coming back to what you're saying about not just me, but for my wife and then our kids. That puts a lot of pressure on someone too, because coming out of this environment that you grew up in with the do's and the don'ts, that somehow instills within you, that's my relationship with God. It's based on do's and don'ts. I earn or reject his love by the way I behave.
It's kind of this toxic two-way cycle, right? Where you have both the pastor and the congregants, especially in places where they've both kind of adopted this need for that certainty, this need for the rule set, this need for the structure, and they're both applying it to each other. So as a pastor, applying it to your church members, your new members, the people you encounter in the community, your own family, there's kind of this judgment of how well people are keeping the rules. But then also from the church members to the pastor, a pastor has to look this way, dress this way, talk this way, do these things, show up at these things, not show up at these things, not talk to these kinds of people. There's just this whole kind of cycle and system built around what each person is imposing on the other, right? Instead of looking at them as somebody on their own path with Jesus, different kind of stages of it, different understandings of what Jesus wants from them. That can lead into some pretty scary stuff, right? There's all these kind of pockets within Christianity of how far you take something. So whether it's health stuff, you can go so far into health stuff that you end up being super unhealthy because you don't eat this, you don't eat this, you don't eat this, you don't eat this. And then you try to apply it to all these other people with completely different situations, budgets, all these different things. There was someone who was telling me that he went to this country and the person was so proud and came to him and said, we made everybody vegetarian. And he looked around and the people were starving. They were malnourished, right? And he was in a place where meat was the most accessible food item and that everything else was very difficult to come by, very expensive. And so he had actually seen how vegetarianism in this circumstance was a danger to the health of the people, not a benefit. And so I think that's one of the examples I think of when it's like, okay, when you just kind of take these concepts and principles and try to apply them the exact same cookie cutter way across the board in every situation to every person in every culture, it doesn't work that way. I know for you, there was a period of your life that you kind of went further and further into this structured ideology, right? Yeah. And found yourself kind of allured by this thing called last generation theology. Now, what the heck is that?
Yeah, last generation theology, the simplified version of that is that God is waiting on a generation of people to live perfectly in obedience to his law, his moral law. You've got pockets of that as well under this large overarching umbrella of last generation theology, and there are some that emphasize certain parts of it more than others. But the idea is God's waiting for this generation to usher in his return because his character would be vindicated by the people who live as Jesus lived, perfect obedience to his law. And so I found myself gravitating towards that as I had this foundation of the do's and don'ts, basically, growing up. It was introduced to me, first of all, by some family members. And hey, check this guy out. Hey, listen to this sermon. Back in the day when you used to pass around CDs and let people listen to messages that way. Nowadays, you can just download it or send a link, whatever. And so I would listen to some of these things. And earlier, you asked me a question about, what was life like in the home, being able to ask questions as a kid growing up. And I kind of just felt like there was enough chaos already going on. I didn't have time to ask those. That came later in life when introduced to this last generation theology. As I enter into this and I feel this whole black and white thing of religion, right? Oh, it's simple. Here's the list of things you do. Here's the list of things you don't do. You do that, you're fine. And yet Jesus talks about this quite a bit, doesn't he? Like you tithe this, you do this, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, like justice and love and mercy and so forth. And so you're doing pretty good. I guess Jesus is applauding their attempts of following this strict list of things. But that's not what the law is all about. The meaning behind that, the spirit of that, are these matters that you're neglecting. And so coming into pastoral ministry, I kind of had this theology or ideology that was at the forefront of my mind, thinking I'm supposed to now tell everybody in my churches about this and expect that they would live up to this. Before I got into pastoral ministry, I went around door to door in Texas in the heat of the summer, knocking on people's doors, offering them books. And I would ask for a donation. We could say I was selling books. That's maybe debatable. But I was there handing out literature and books that really taught our Adventist faith, Some of them are great books. Some of them are health books. And I loved that work. And it was easy, right, to go knock on a door, 30 seconds to 5-minute conversation, just depending on how long I was standing there, leave this with them and feel like, and pat myself on the back and feel like I've accomplished the work and move on to the next person, okay? Here's the list, so to speak. Here's what you need to do. Here's the truth. Here's what you should be living by. And then leave that in their hands to figure out and expect that they'll be where they need to be. So I came into pastoral ministry with this very black and white idea of what it meant to be a Christian or a follower of Jesus. Instead of having these 5-minute conversations with people in my church, I'm getting to know them, right? I'm spending time with them. I'm listening to them. I'm hearing them. And those black and white issues that I thought were very clear began to start to merge together and become more gray. And that's when questions started to happen in my life. Like, wait a second. I was taught this is the do and don't. This is very clear, but I'm navigating something that doesn't fit in that. It doesn't fit in that box. How do I navigate that? How do I help this person deal with this issue specifically in their life? And so those areas of gray is when I began to ask these questions about this last generation theology, because we're supposed to live perfectly in this box, in this area. And when we do that, Jesus can come. Okay, well, we want Jesus to come. Let's go tell everybody about this list of things we're supposed to do so that he can come. But then as you navigate and spend time in people's lives and journey with them, you realize this box list over here isn't helping them in their current situation right now. Yeah. It's not fixing that problem. They need something else. They need love. They need grace. They need mercy. They need someone to be there for them. They don't need a list of rules. And that was what I realized coming into pastoral ministry and began to ask a lot of questions about this teaching with last generation theology. Like, wait a second, something's not right. And it actually led me on a journey of 5 years in a row, reading front to back, reading different translations, just to see, is what they're teaching, can I find this in Scripture? Is this something God really is asking of us? And that was very enlightening as well, going through that, journeying with people in their own personal lives, seeing things happening there, asking questions about that myself to God, like, wait a second, God, if this is the way we're supposed to do it, how do I navigate this? It was a pivoting point in my life, a new paradigm, if you will, to recognize this teaching, this ideology while it's on paper, it seems interesting. It's appeasing to the person that's looking for the list of things to do and not do. And it's easy, I think, to hold over somebody else's life, right? I can expect more of you than I can of myself. That's an easy thing to do, as a pastor especially. But then if you truly are wanting to help people and navigate and journey with them in life, this thing's not really helping me do that as a pastor.
And I can relate to a lot of that, even though last generation theology was never a phrase that I heard, but the need for structure, especially in my late teens and early 20s, even down to marriage books. I got married at 20 years old. And so I have a lot of dysfunction in my family. You know, I come from kind of a bad home life, divorced parents. And so what I needed, I was like, well, I can't look to any of my family as an example of how to be a husband. So I start looking for, Christian marriage advice books. And basically, I just knew if people respected the person that they were probably right. And so I would read these books and devour them and try to live what they were saying, and I would apply the judgment and the principles both to myself and my partner. And I just created this environment in our early marriage where my partner just never felt like she could live up to. It was never going to be good enough. There was never a day that she was just going to meet all those standards. And even though I would, in my own mind, try to be nice about it, I wasn't trying to be controlling, I wasn't trying to be a bad partner. But I was like, this is how marriage is supposed to work, and ours doesn't work that way. And so it just made me also unhappy. As I've grown and as I've learned and completely tried to transform this kind of psychology in my own life, I can see the difference in how we relate to each other. We're close in a way we never were. We're happy in a way we never were. And when people talk about religion and faith and theology, especially in Adventist spaces, truth as like scientific fact almost. Like, these are the rules, these are the way they work, this is the way God works, and it's all in this little box. It's all explainable, it's all testable. My life and the way that I love people and the way I see them flourishing around me has completely changed, not by prioritizing that, but by prioritizing there is a truth in how we relate to people. There's a truth in the effect of what we do. And if the people around you are withering, if the people around you are unhappy and dying inside when you're there, there's a higher truth than whatever the list of rules and facts you have in your brain are. That truth is something's wrong. That truth is there's a way that you should be relating to people that does lead to their growth. And I've gone through so much change psychologically and ideologically in the past decade because I started prioritizing, how can I help? How can I become presence of relief to this person? And when I went back to the Bible, the Jesus I saw was different. The God I saw was different. The people are different, right? I'm seeing all these new ways and all these new things in their story. I think of the woman at the well, for example. In that story, in the very beginning, before Jesus talks to her, all the disciples go away, right? And it doesn't say Jesus sent them away, but I think that Jesus wanted them to be gone in that moment. Because if you imagine 12, 13 dudes from a majority culture, right? So you're not safe as a woman. You're not safe as your race, your belief system. If 13 guys are there, you're not going to open up about your life. You're going to run away. Like, you're in danger.
Intimidating.
Yeah. And they really did present a danger to her because their culture, really denigrated the Samaritan culture, right? But what I see in that moment when the 12 disciples go away and it's just Jesus and the woman, he has this way of connecting, of prioritizing her life, of elevating her within their respective cultures, of saying, like, tell me about yourself, right? Like, why are you here? What are you doing? Tell me about your life. I know these things about your life, right? He's prompting, facilitating conversation with her. He's inviting her into dialogue instead of like, I'm going to tell you all the things you did wrong. And the more I read the stories of Jesus, the more I saw those actions where his disciples, they don't respect kids, they don't respect women, they don't respect Samaritans, they don't respect people of this class, all these different things. They only the people of privilege in their culture were the ones that they looked up to. And Jesus turns that on its head and he says, let the children come to me. Mm-hmm. Right? He creates these spaces of safety for people, even when all of his friends don't want that. And so using that as a model, using that as the primary truth in our life, and coming back to that, what Jesus says of like all of the law and the prophets hang on these two things: love God, love other people. When you make that priority, it changes how you interact with everybody.
Everyone has this standard that they're supposed to live by, whether that was taught to them or given to them, like what was to my mother, I believe. Here's welcome to the church. Here's a list of things to do. Teach your kids this. And that's it. Okay, well, I guess that's what I'll do. And so that standard was passed on. And everyone's got this idea of what that standard is. But if Jesus comes into the picture and says, hey, the standard you've been holding on to is not the standard I'm asking you to do. It's this one. And on these two hang all the law and the prophets, right? It's these two that motivate everything in life. And so having all this chaos in my life growing up, constant move, constant change, constant instability, not really knowing how to have those relationships because it was more surface level, it was more outward focus, trying to live out what I think God expects of me and what my members expect of me, and then trying to expect that with my family. And I actually found a book that is by Henry Cloud and John Townsend, How People Grow. And I started reading this book, How People Grow, thinking, okay, growth, journey, safe places for people to grow and nourish. And for the first time, the gospel really was communicated in a relevant, meaningful, impactful, beautiful way. And I thought, well, if that's the gospel, what have I been doing? I'm a pastor, right? I mean, I've been leading people. I thought I was telling them the gospel of Jesus, but I wasn't telling them this. And that began a huge shift in my life because the emphasis was relational. It wasn't so much about, here's the list of things, right? Jesus died to save you from all the bad stuff you've done in your past. Now live this way. Well, okay, I guess, but I want to be motivated by something else than just a list of things, right? Out of fear. And so that was a huge part of that change, of that paradigm shift for me, to recognize the way I see God and how he sees me is the way I see other people. And for the longest time in my life, I saw God as someone who expects this of me, and didn't see him as someone who says, you're my beautiful child, I love you. Or like Jesus encountering this woman at the well, I care for you, I know what you've done, and I still accept you and love you. And so I had lived a lot of my life out of what I thought God saw me as or what he expected me of. And as I began to understand how he loves me in spite of all of this stuff and the motivation he wanted to bring out of that love to have a better life, it was just, I don't know, like what? I don't understand that. I've been doing this completely different my entire life. And so that was revolutionary.
If there's one kind of soundbite or something that people take from this show, I think that they should remember what you just said. The way that you look at other people is kind of reflected by the way that you think God sees you. If I had to condense how I see God now, it's just this overwhelmingly loving, compassionate friend that says, I got you. It's okay.
Yeah.
I got you.
And it's okay to journey. For so much of my, I say, ministry and even personal experience with church, with a denomination, the emphasis has often been, not always, but often been the destination. Get ready for that destination. Prepare yourself for that destination, et cetera, et cetera. And yet I read in Scripture that it's God who is at work in you, preparing you for that destination. And so the journey is that moment at a time to recognize God's presence in that journey, and giving you that safe space to journey, to ask questions, to even doubt, right? We get nervous when we start allowing people, hey, it's okay to doubt. Well, I mean, the disciples doubted again and again and again, and Jesus was, he would recognize that and say, hey, here's a moment, an opportunity to grow and learn from this. Not disparage them, not, condemn them, criticize them. This was an opportunity to learn and grow and journey together as Jesus is there with you each step of the way. If there's anything I wish I could do differently, it would be to have provided a safer place for people to journey, to ask questions. As I've had this pivotal moment in my life, this paradigm shift, to recognize it's okay to be in a safe place to journey and to have questions, I've been reading more and more books of different views. Some of them I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Some of them, I don't know about that. But there's this one book in particular that it's called Faith Unraveled. Being a Christian isn't about agreeing to a certain way. It's about embodying a certain way. That's the relational component. For the longest time, it was about agreeing to a certain way and then expecting everybody else to live that certain way, rather than embodying. Right? That's what Christ did. He embodied the way. He was the way. And so that one has stood out to me as far as this journeying, experiencing, and allowing us to figure out, how do I embody this way? Did Jesus mean what he said when he offered abundant life to people? Is that just at the destination time, or can we experience that now? And do we journey through and into that abundant life that he wants to give us? And do we allow people that safe space to figure that out? Encouraging them, coaching them, sure. Leading them, helping them. But at the end of the day, they have to have their relationship and work through that and figure that out and journey through that. We are there to support them, not criticize them as they journey.
I think one of the reasons this conversation is so important right now, we've gone through this massive cultural shift, not just in the United States, but I think in a lot of the world. The world used to be a place where people needed a line item explanation of everything to believe it was true. And this is true with, scientific explanations. This is true with religious and business explanations. One thing that's changed in the past couple of decades, though, is that we're in a world where new discoveries, new technology, new ideas, we're flooded with them constantly every day. And so there's a lot of new questions that come from that. And it just kind of creates this pattern of looking at the world where certainty, you really have to hold on to that loosely. Hundreds of years ago, cell phone technology would have been seen as like witchcraft and magic, right? Radio waves, impossible. You can't see them, you can't smell them, you can't hear them. How can they exist? But when you grow up in a world where the way things work changes every day, changes all the time, when somebody comes and says, this is definitely how it is, and I already know everything there is to know, and you just need to accept it, we say no. Flat out no. It's repulsive in a way, because it's like living in that world where there's always more information you don't know yet. Living in that world where there's always new aspects to consider, even going into how was the Bible translated, who wrote this, why, all of those different things. We're full of questions. And one misstep I think the church often takes is trying to come up with a solid line item explanation of everything instead of what are the principles at work here? What are the main things that we need? And even Jesus did this.
Yeah.
Jesus coming into this society, if you look at what Jesus was doing and what the expectations of Jesus were, he turns them on their head constantly. He's talking to people he's not supposed to talk to. He's hanging out with people that are seen as like the worst of sinners, right? He's healing people on the Sabbath. He's doing all these things that are breaking the rules, and they don't understand that he's the God who wrote them. And so even now, living close to Portland, it's like seen as this super sinful, secular city. And we have this question of how do we apply our Christian faith here? How do we talk to other people and relate to them? And when you take the principles instead of the rules, it becomes so much more natural. People really aren't out to hate you for being Christian for the most part. I think a lot of people have been hurt by Christians, but more than anything, they just want some humility. They want you to be able to say, this is the best I understand. This is why I believe this, not this is definitely fact and I know more than you.
Not only humility, but the vulnerability that comes with that, right? Jesus lived a certain way that I know I feel constantly trying to replicate in my own life and in my own strength. And there's a vulnerability that should come with that. There is something that is powerful in that same book about Faith Unraveled, where she describes why she's an evolutionist. But what she means by that is the ability for you and your faith to grow, to adapt, to change. That's okay. Right? We should change it should grow stronger. It should grow in different ways. And the whole debate of whether culture influences that change or not, I'm not even talking about that. Like if we grow closer to Jesus, we should be changing. That's the journey. That's the point of the journey.
I love that point because I think it's a non-negotiable now for the church to evolve.
Yes.
I don't know that was always true.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting with people who don't want to see change in the church, who don't want it to be influenced by culture, there's lots of ways that culture can influence the church for the better. If you look at the time where, women had zero rights, especially in Christian spaces. If you look at the time where we're racially segregated, where there were preachers standing up preaching that slavery was given to us as a gift from God. You have all of these really offensive things and horrible things. And you don't see a lot of people saying we should go back to that. So it's a good thing that the church grew. Jesus doesn't change, but we should.
Yes.
And the church should. We should always be growing. And this idea that we already understand all that we need to know and there's no new discoveries has never been true, ever. and it's not good for it to be true.
If we're holding on to Jesus, we will change, right? That's what the Bible tells us of that. He's in the work of transformation. Unfortunately, for me, a good portion of my life, what I was holding on to was a standard, a list, a law, if you will. And that wasn't what's going to transform me. The focus was on that fruit bearing, right? That list of whatever those items were, the standard, the practices, rather than the intimate and close relationship that God desires to have with every one of us.
One of the things I remember last season, Pastor Jose Rojas said, what your elders need most is the ministry of presence. What they need most is time with you. And I've found that to be true with people of all ages, is that intimacy can't be forced, but creating space for intimacy usually leads to it. So when you're intentional about spending time with somebody, when you're intentional about listening to them and creating space for them to kind of lead and guide that experience you have together, whatever you're doing, when you make room for them to be themselves around you and you ask questions about your life, when you get curious, that intimacy is the natural result. And especially when you're willing to listen to their story and perspective as often and as intentionally as possible. Whether they share your faith or not, I really think that's most of what Jesus was up to in his person-to-person ministry on earth, is just creating that space for people to be known and seen and loved. And I think it makes all the difference in the world.
And there's another great thought that has impacted me in this journey. I was reading a book about the practice of stillness and silence, and I thought, I'm going to try that. The first time I took my phone out to set a 1-minute timer or whatever, I'm just going to try it for a minute. It felt like 14 hours. It's like, when is this alarm going to go off? I'm sitting there quietly, eyes closed, trying not to get busy with the day, the thoughts, and everything. It felt like forever. It's become easier since, but I share that because that practice has influenced just in ways I can't even explain, providing that safe and intimate space for God to come in, to meet, to fill me with just good things. We don't create intimacy. We make spaces for intimacy to occur or to happen. That was revolutionary for me, because now I look at these practices of prayer and solitude and this practice of having devotion time and quiet time with Jesus, not as another list thing that I need to accomplish, but as an intimate, intentional space for Jesus to come and pour out his love into my life. Some of these books that I've been reading that talk about the practices Jesus had and how we can practice those as well is not another list of rules, right? To practice prayer, to practice silence and solitude, to practice fasting. Those practices aren't the ends either. Those are, if you will, the channel with which the Holy Spirit comes in and reveals things to you. Prayer is to just simply let yourself be loved by God. How difficult that is for many of us. It's true. That can be a very difficult thing, to just simply be still, open up your arms, sit there, and let yourself be loved by God. For those that are looking for that certainty or need something to hold on to, I'd say to not let go of the standard. Let God bring the standard into your life. Let God journey you through that standard, whatever that is.
I mean, if you want a hard standard, go back to Leviticus.
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
Go try to keep all of that.
Yeah.
It tells you how to cut your hair. It tells you what kind of clothes you can wear. It talks about tattoos. I mean, all these different things. And it's interesting which of those we sometimes choose to kind of add back in.
Yeah.
When there's tons of them that we don't. But when you look at the principles, when you look at, okay, how does the Bible describe love? How does the Bible describe Jesus and how he interacted with people? When you use those principles as your core truth and your core faith, the answers are a lot easier to come by in the wildly different situations that life throws at you, when you have principles to work from, not just a list of like, okay, what day do I do this? How do I do it? How did this thousands of year old texts talk about it in their culture?
Yeah. For me, it was almost a matter of, okay, here's everything I've been taught, and that's fine. I just want to take all of that and set that over here for just a second and rebuild on that firm foundation of Christ and his love. How do I now rebuild this thing, this experience, this journey? What does it look like? For a lot of people, that's a very scary, intimidating, nervous place to be, because all of my identity sometimes is tied to these standards, these things that I've chased after for so many years. And so it can be a very uncomfortable place to be in. Does God still love me if I set aside this Sabbath practice for just a moment to understand what this truly means to me rather than just what the commandment says for a context and a culture of a certain time? How do I do that? I don't have cows. How do I make my cows rest? And so if we can set some of those off to the side and say, all right, here's, for just a moment, let's reevaluate my personal experience with Jesus. And what does that look like? Not within a denomination, but just as a follower of him. It's interesting, the fruit of the Spirit, right? We've talked about that perhaps in small group studies, and we list these things that none of which have to do with coffee or vegetarianism or the way you dress, or love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. And then Paul says, against such there is no law. The Spirit coming into your life, living out these principles that are eternal, right? These are beautiful principles that the world is hungry for as well. How we treat one another with kindness and gentleness, self-control when we're in traffic, all of those things. Against such there is no law. You don't need a law to govern that when the Spirit brings that into your life and you live it out. That's a fulfillment of that law as Jesus came and did.
Growing up, we were a really rules-based community. Very, very strict, very, very one way, very my way or the highway from the pastor we had. There's a Bible verse about some people needing milk, like when they're young in their faith kind of thing. And that was always applied to people who didn't want the rules, right? And that was like, well, they don't really understand the rules, so they're not keeping them because they're young in their faith. They're immature in their faith, all of this. The mature people in their faith keep the rules. As I've progressed through life, I see something different. So when you go back to the Old Testament, you see a group of slaves that needed structure, that needed rules, that everything had been so regimented that they needed
almost like a military. Almost.
Yeah. And so you kind of get this demand for rules, and God's like, okay, here's the laws to live by. You don't understand the principles, so just don't do these things and do these things. To me, it's kind of like when you have a small child. You can't just say, hey, it's bad to run in the street. It's bad to touch hot things. Don't drink these things. And so you just make a list. Don't go near the oven. Don't run outside in the street. Is it bad to kind of cross the street if there's no cars? We know it's not as adults, right? But for your kid, it's better to just say, stay off the street. And so to me, as I've grown, that concept of kind of immature faith, that kind of need to grow comes from like, well, I need rules because I don't understand the principles. A mature faith understands the principles behind the rules. And I think that's what we see Jesus bringing in the New Testament is a full understanding of where those rules came from. Right? It's the principles to operate by that are eternal, that represent God no matter where, no matter what, no matter who. That's spiritual maturity to me. And I think that's what the world right now, and especially in the American church, is crying out for, is spiritual maturity that gets past those rules, that gets past the guidelines, that says, what kind of God is this? And how can it make me a kinder, more compassionate, more Christ-like person?